time. It was basically a wake-up call for China-based teams that at a moment where there was the fewest amount of foreign executive visits, foreign journalists on the ground, tourist visits to China, at a moment where China was more consequential to the global economy but more opaque to global executives than it had been in decades. And at a moment where every single global organization was reevaluating their China strategy, really at that time, China-based teams both didn't know that that was happening and were involved in those deliberations. So it's an existential crisis for those China-based teams. For decades, maybe at least a decade, China-based teams have been able to point at the numbers and haven't had to collaborate well. Because they've just been able to say, look at our numbers. What do you mean we're not doing well? We don't have to be nice. We don't have to be smart. We don't have to advocate for ourselves. We don't have to understand the wants and needs of headquarters. We just deliver. And for headquarters, they often felt like they didn't understand China. But have you seen the numbers recently? There's not nearly as sophisticated an understanding as is necessary for global investors when trying to understand what the government is going to do, especially these last 3 or 4 years. They don't understand the degree to which the government is beholden to the people. And the government legislates predictably and consistently to the middle of the population.
Welcome to another episode of Baiguan Radio, where top China experts share their insights about China's business affairs. Today, I'm honored to invite my good friend Zak Dychtwald to our program. Zak is the founder and CEO of Young China Group, a market insights firm and consultancy based between China and the US. He leads YCG Bridgeworks, a global collaboration lab focused on a people-first, data-backed approach to improving collaboration between global teams, spanning both culture as well as generational gaps, with a special focus on US-China. Zak is also the author of critically acclaimed Young China, How the Restless Generation Will Change Their Country and the World, available in 6 languages. Impressive track record aside, I also find Zak to be an astounding personality. He speaks one of the most fluent Chinese that I ever hear from an expat. He has a unique background story, merging academic interest with entrepreneurship. He is also one of the few people who came back to China after COVID, reinvented his business, and has hit success after success since then. Today, we will take an inside look at his secret sauce for business success in China's tougher landscape today. Thanks, Zak. Thanks for coming to Baiguan Radio. It's been several months since we've done another episode, and it's so great that you help us restart the series. I always find you a unique and extraordinary person. You are right now based in Shanghai. You've been to China for many years, spent some years away, but you finally came back during worst of possible time. You run a business in Shanghai as well, just as many expats were leaving. Could you give us some idea of where do you come from? When and why did you come to China in the first place?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So first, thank you for having me. I'm a big fan of yours. I'm a big fan of Baiguan. My name is Zak Dychtwald. I'm 34, now based in Shanghai. I'm a relatively new Shanghai resident, about 1.5 years now, which doesn't feel like that much time.
Where were you before Shanghai?
So during COVID, I got stuck out of China, but I first came to China in 2011 as a study abroad student, Greater China. So I was at the University of Hong Kong, where I'd come to Shenzhen on the weekends. And, Shenzhen specifically was my first interest in spending real time in mainland China. That was 2011. So nearly 15 years ago now. The longest I've been in one place would be Chengdu from the years 2013 to 2016, 2017. I lived in Beijing for 2 years, but was traveling a lot. During COVID, I got stuck outside. I left my apartment in Beijing in January of 2020. I was speaking at some investment conferences in the United States. It was a 2-week trip. That 2-week trip turned into 3 years and a marriage. I was in Mexico for about 1 year and change of COVID, and otherwise was in Northern California.
Mm-hmm.
So we got back here pretty much as soon as we could. I became a we, which was exciting.
Mm-hmm.
And that was in March of 2023, moved to Shanghai in June of 2023, and have sort of restarted my business, certainly pivoted it pretty strongly from what I was doing during and before COVID. So I run an organization called Young China Group. We do a combination of market and workforce insights.
Mm-hmm.
The market insights is typically geared towards investors. We work with some brands as well. It is consumer focused with a generational lens, really building on the foundation that I built with the book. So I wrote a book, which I forgot to mention. It came out in 2018 called Young China, How the Restless Generation Will Change Their Country and the World. Macmillan Press came out.
How old was you when you wrote that book?
I was 24 when I pitched it. I was 27 when it came out. I'm 34 now. Father Time is undefeated, and I am in the midst of losing that battle. I was recently young, is how I sort of describe my current life stage.
You need to change the name of the company now.
Middle-aged China Group does not sound as sexy. But, it's not just about age. It's also about this new identity of China today. Let me just quickly finish the second part that my company does. So market insights and workforce insights.
Sure.
The workforce insights is we work with global companies with teams in the US, China, or China and India, or, typically China at the fulcrum, and we help them collaborate better. We have a mixture of solutions for that, including a quantitative diagnostic. That's become really the heart of the business over the last 12 months.
You mentioned Chengdu, which was not a typical place for some of my other expat friends how do they start their China experience? What were you doing in Chengdu?
Chengdu. So I spent a year in Suzhou I went to Columbia. I studied literature, business, and psychology. I first came to Suzhou because there's a saying, 上有天堂, 下有苏杭. And I'm like, above there is heaven, on earth there is Suzhou and Hangzhou.
Right.
When I studied abroad, I came to Suzhou for a couple days. I had a good time. And I had graduated really with the only intention of studying Mandarin for a year. And truthfully, I was afraid of becoming a consultant or an investor like all of my friends abruptly were. I was in a Bain interview back in New York when I more or less snapped. And I'm like, I'm going to go to China. I intentionally did not do any of the programs. I think I applied for Princeton in Asia and a couple other programs that were great and available, but I was really trying to get off that track that so many of us kind of get hooked onto. But truthfully, I thought it'd be a year and then I'd reapply to Bain and just be a consultant somewhere. So Suzhou was where I started, but Suzhou I quickly realized was kind of just a suburb of Shanghai, even back in 2012. And so it was hard to get out of expat bubbles. And I was really determined to do that. Part of that was really just language study. My favorite language blogger, a guy named Katsumono, who writes the blog All Japanese All the Time, which was recommended to me by my early linguistic hero, a guy named Jackson Davis, who used to be in Suzhou, far and away the best linguist in Suzhou at the time, who said, you don't learn a language, you get used to it. Right. And so I was in the process of shifting my entire mental diet, what I was feeding my brain into being in Mandarin. In 2012, there was a lot of interest in Chongqing. So there was this develop the West effort, politically Chongqing was interesting. Yeah, exactly. That was politically Chongqing was interesting at the time. But Chongqing and Chengdu, Ford had just opened up a couple of factories there. There was this real sense that Chongqing and Chengdu together might become sort of what Shenzhen was in the 90s. That isn't what happened. No. But Chengdu and Chongqing became something special. So I originally moved out, I originally was planning to move to Chongqing, but it was in Chongqing that I met a 21-year-old kid from Guizhou who, in a hostel I was staying at, I was a big backpacker at the time, who I really hit it off with. And for those of you who are expats in China, you know that it's sometimes difficult to make good friends from here. Right. I think in cities like Suzhou, a lot of the friends I was making who were from China, it was based on our differences. So it was like, oh, I'm from China, you're from the US. That's kind of interesting. I eat this, you eat that. That's interesting. They wanted to practice their English. I wanted to practice my Chinese. Less friendships, more function. But this kid in particular, we talked about music all night. And so the next day, his name was Huan Huan. We traveled around Chongqing together, and then we ended up hitchhiking to Chengdu. we stayed in this hostel called CC Waidao, West outside island. It no longer exists. It was sort of in the gray area of legal on the outskirts of town outside of the Third Ring Road. Right. And it was there that I really found a sense of place in China. I made really close friends. And Chengdu is a phenomenal city, but what it was mostly to me was a place where I had a great group of Chinese friends and a sense of place. And so I decided to move there.
That's unique because I don't think many of the either expats or international foreign friend or people in China had that, as you say, the sense of place, the community.
It's hard to build. Yeah. It's hard to build. It's hard to find. And I had the luxury of being young, broke, and didn't have student debt. I think about this specific issue often, that if I had student debt, that would have totally transformed my set of options. And, I went to public school my whole life, and then Columbia was expensive. And my grandparents, from when I was very young, had put money away for that. So I'm extraordinarily, it's a massive privilege. And it's one that I think I took good advantage of, truthfully, by spending that time traveling, exploring, and prioritizing other things that wasn't just money. It was a risk. I started my own business when I was 27. The year before that, I had worked a real job, but for like 9 months. And then I've kind of flirted with you get off the career track, and then you're about to get to the point where you're pretty much unemployable for the rest of your life, and then veered back on. And then you get sort of too businessy for too long, and then you kind of have to want to become a little bit more academic. And those two, I think of myself as the most academic sort of business person, and then the most businessy academic person, and both communities kind of reject me. But I've been able to get close to those lines without going over throughout my life.
And can I say the first biggest milestone in your career is that book?
Without a doubt.
Right.
And I didn't write it, and people, there's varying degrees of belief on this, but I didn't write it to start a career. I did write it to not have to go home. When I was 23, 24, my parents were like, what are you doing? Right. I'm like, I am living in a hostel with 30 Chinese kids researching for something. They're like, researching for what? I'm like, just trust me. Which is like I sound like an addict more than a proper, careerist or something. So the book was a way to formalize ideas that I had. It was a way to prolong my time there. It was a way to justify the interest and research I wanted to do. I did not expect it to launch a career. And so it veers into the investing world, which I know is your world, and a lot of the people who listen to, Baiguan FM. I'm making up names for you. Baiguan Radio. But it's not one that I had any exposure to before, but it certainly is what launched what has become a more traditional career.
Right. So after the book, you founded a company.
So yeah, I can take you back to 2018. The book comes out. When I was finishing the book, I had moved back to New York because I was really indulging in being a writer in China, which means that you don't hit your deadlines. And so I went back to New York to also try to be closer to the audience. I was starting to write something academic, and what I didn't want to do was write something academic. I wanted to write something that general readers could read. I wanted to be story driven. I didn't want it to be about the exceptional of China, like the super rich, super poor, right, Maserati driving, or like dog eating festival. That's a version of China that Bloomberg covers, and it's interesting, but it's not it's not the people first version that I sort of fell in love with.
Right.
And so I moved back to New York, and I had to get a job because the book advance I had lasted for about 72 hours in New York after it had lasted me a very happy year in Chengdu. And so I was running the China practice of a small consultancy in New York. These are fancier words than the actual job was. And I was doing that for about 8-9 months. I was writing from 4 to 8 in the morning. I was going to this full-time job, and then I was writing on the weekends. And it was a very quick way to finish the book, which had taken me a long time otherwise. When the book came out, I was planning on becoming, like I said, an academic or a journalist. And what I did was I spoke with academics and journalists.
I see.
And speaking with them dissuaded me from either profession very quickly. Journalists, I have some very strong memories of actually being at the foreign correspondence club in Hong Kong. I'm not going to say who it was, but someone had a couple extra drinks and took me aside after I did my talk. And they said, Zach, you've got a lot of potential. Whatever you do, do not become a journalist because there's no dignity in this profession anymore in China. Oh. And sort of the same thing happened in academia. And so I also had one or two clients who I had brought on to this other company who said they would support me and come out, like they were trying to hire me full time. I said, no, I don't want to do that. But they're like, why don't you just make us your first clients? And I was like, oh, that's an option. And so I did that. And I was also promoting the book at the same time. I started to get calls from Wall Street. And so in 2018, if you were interested in China, you were interested in investing in China. If you're interested in investing in China in public equities, you were investing in A shares. If you were interested in A shares, you were interested in consumers. And if you were interested in consumers, you were interested in young people. Yeah. And so if you're interested in young people in China, you found me. And I started to get invited to speak at investing conferences. And I didn't know the word A shares at the time, truthfully. Like I was just it wasn't my world. And that's what I've heard. It's been a funny ride getting to know the investment world. But I started to get invited to speak. I spoke at CLSA. That speech led to another speech at CLSA. That speech led to a bunch more with some of their clients. I did speech and debate in high school and I was a state champion. And so I knew a little bit about how to structure a speech, and it turned into me bouncing around Wall Street and other investment capitals around the world. In that 18-month period before COVID, I spoke on 6 different continents. It was mostly a speaking business, but we also, my goal was to take that interest and basically try to fund a research organization that was doing the research I was doing for the book, that at scale and with resources that a young broke author couldn't access. Right. COVID, of course, disrupted all of that, as well as some of the new rules around wholly owned foreign entities being able to gather public data.
Okay. Looking back, do you find that 2018 or 19 was really like the height in terms of China interest?
It was the height in terms of my awareness of China interest. So, a lot of people have talked with me about young China and how do they write a book about China. And, I was fortunate enough to get a starred review with Publishers Weekly. Wall Street Journal wrote up a big piece on it the day it came out. I was 27. I didn't know anybody. I didn't have any contacts. I wasn't the New York Times China guy. I was lucky to seize on a moment that I, in retrospect, realized was peak investor interest in China. And so my book, which was not a business book, if you read it, it was very much not a business book, but it started to become one, or at least in the investment community, it was considered one. And of course, since then, I have watched the precipitous decline in interest in investment in China. And so I didn't realize that I had hopped on to the peak of the wave. I'm like, this is great. I'm just going to do this forever. And then that forever ended pretty viciously. In March of 2020, I lost all of my clients in 1 month, every single one. All of my revenue went to zero for that year. And so the last 2020. Yeah. And my biggest client at the time that was on retainer was in travel, and people weren't traveling anymore. I was speaking at a lot of conferences. I was booked out for the year. No one had conferences anymore, and the online stuff pays much differently. And a lot of it just evaporated. And so I spent time having to really pivot my business. They ended up being fine years, mostly solopreneur years, truthfully. But like many people, especially 2021 to 2023, I wasn't sure what China was going to become. I think we're still figuring it out, but those years we were very much in the valley of foresight, right? Like when you're trying to predict the future, it's better to be in a high place looking out. We were all sort of in this deep, dark inflection point, unclear towards which direction China would inflect. I think we're still discovering that now, but it feels less like we don't know what's going to happen a month from now.
We'll come back to this, but before that, for the people who haven't read your book before, is there like a quick summary or quick thesis that a key point that you want to?
I can put it in the context a little bit of my work today. The book was focused on identity of the post-90s generation in China.
Okay.
And 90后, exactly. And so it's sort of millennials, but the actual best analogy for them is baby boomers in the US. And the reason is both were pivot generations. So the older generations in China were really subsistence generations. In 1990, the per capita GDP was around $300. And so the parents of this generation were clawing their way out of deep poverty, often begging for extra hours at the factory at the end of the week just to make a better life for the next generation. That next generation is the post-90s generation. And so they have lived through the most remarkable period of growth in the history of modern economics. That's not an exaggeration. It's just fact. There's a number of different metrics we can point to for that. By the way, that's a double-edged sword. So it creates these expectations that during a slow period, which we're in now, cannot be met and is seriously impacting the psychology of this generation. So the book is really focused on identity issues. There's 3 different chapters on schooling at different ages about Gaokao and the pressure of that. There's a chapter on fun, how the older generation didn't have the luxury of fun. And the younger generation doesn't want to 吃苦, right? They don't want to eat bitter anymore. They want to 活在当下. They want to enjoy the moment, live in the moment. There's a quote that we used to joke about in Chengdu when we're eating 烤鱼 or hot pot, which was 今朝有酒,今朝醉. Today we have booze, so today we'll get drunk. The idea is we'll enjoy what we have now. Those generational shifts in China have happened so much more quickly because of the pace of change. And so whereas the rest of the world has generation gaps, which we hear a lot about, the whole okay boomer thing in the US, China's pace of change means that these generations, they're actually generational gulfs. The distance between generations is much more severe. And so a lot of what I try to put forward in Young China is this people first approach that now drives all of my work, trying to humanize a place. Particularly when we look at China, we look at 2 versions, right? We look at the macroeconomy, which is exciting on good days, or scary. It's been much more scary the last bunch of years. Or a government, which is mostly scary to global observers. It's very hard to feel empathy for a macroeconomy. It's even harder to feel empathy for the CCP, regardless of your perspectives. I would say the same thing about the US government. But people you can access and understand. And I think for your audience, for investors, what I see most often missing in people's calculus of trying to understand what's happening in China is an understanding of the people. And that's not just in terms of consumer trends, it's also understanding what the government does and why. There's not nearly as sophisticated an understanding as is necessary for global investors when trying to understand what the government is going to do, especially these last 3 or 4 years. They don't understand the degree to which the government is beholden to the people, and not the top 2% top 1% who creates businesses, or top 25% who consumes and moves a stock like Alibaba, but all of the people. And the government legislates predictably and consistently to the middle of the population. What this guy Marco Papic, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, talks about as the median citizen within China. And so understanding the median citizen, which is again poli-sci speak for just average folks, gives you an advantage and a window into China that most people miss.
Yes, that's great. You mentioned this connectivity, this relation between the population, the median citizen, and government choices, right? Last several years, Chinese government has created, to many people, great surprises and pivots in policies, right? We have COVID, we have economic policies and all that. Was there any event that, given what you have learned about China on the ground at a real human basis, is there anything that still took you by surprise?
I think the timing of many things took me by surprise. But, go back to 2021, the summer storm, right? Particularly the education crackdown, but a pretty broad crackdown. For those of you who, I had been tracking for years the pressure vortex of Chinese education and how it was increasingly distancing itself from a meritocracy. The Gaokao system in a lot of ways is more meritocratic than we have in the US. If you believe that testing can be a good reflection on people's preparation for higher education. The US is taking an opposite approach right now, but when you have 10 plus million people, 20 million people trying to go to college every year, how do you sift through that? Gaokao is relatively meritocratic. But it also creates this vicious prioritization of testing and this pressure cooker of what we think of as the project of childhood. So the project of childhood being primarily focused on becoming a better tester in China. Now, the haves and have-nots of that process, the people who could afford extra schooling, who could afford to get their kids out of that system, right? To put them into on an SAT or an ACT track to get them to study abroad, was creating palpable rifts in society. Even the ability to buy an apartment in a better testing province or city that would give you better odds of getting into the elite institutions. It was clearly becoming a distorted ecosystem of haves and have-nots. Now, that is true. Did I expect the solution to be blowing up some of the more, what I saw is like really incredibly successful examples of Chinese innovation to destroy after-school programs, to create what was perceived as a more meritocratic system for the entire country? No, I did not. Could I understand it in retrospect? Yes. Did I accurately predict it? I did not. But to me that signaled a pivot. Signaled a pivot of, instead of focusing on that top quartile, consumers and entrepreneurs, really entrepreneurs being the top, let's call it 2%, whatever, however you want to imagine it, but really the top quartile of China as consumers. Pinduoduo unearthed another 50% of the country who otherwise wasn't able to interact with consumption. I talked a lot about Pinduoduo in 2018 and 2019 because of that. But most people aren't consuming at national or even global levels. That really makes them show up on the consumption Richter scale. So that to me signaled a reorientation of the government towards that person rather than that top quartile. And we've really been in that buckle down, focus on the median of the population, much more than the portion of the population who global investors liked when the government focused on, who the government focused on, which is that top quartile who's spending, consuming, buying property, creating companies. So it's unfortunate, it's a useful predictive tool. It doesn't help with timing. It certainly allows you to read trends.
Right. But it certainly, I think it preps you psychologically that you had experience with the median population, the median citizen. So yeah.
It lets you understand why the government is doing it. Like it wasn't a mystery why the government did this to me. It wasn't a mystery to me why the government did this. They didn't do this to me. Although I did have clients in that sector. So you talk about 2021 being a tough year. It creates a logic for what the government does, and it's a reminder of who they legislate for. It's also a reminder for what will keep them in power. Like if you go back to 2021, even though there was a sense that within China, that China was doing better than the rest of the world on COVID, the core focus of the government was stability. And even though it's the top quartile who can make an economy successful, it's what I think of as, so there's the consumer portion of China's population, top quartile, maybe top third if you're getting generous. And then the rest of the population I think of as political China. These are the people who keep the government in power. And the Chinese government is very cognizant of history, where keeping the majority of people happy keeps parties in power. As simple as that. And so during the bumpy ride of the economy, making sure that the most amount of people feel like they're being taken care of instead of just the top, particularly for a political system that doesn't have the pressure valves of certainly the U.S. democratic system, democratic republic, however you want to think about it. Yeah, it becomes a priority for the government.
When did you start to have this idea? That was in Chengdu?
I didn't realize that other people didn't. I think, truthfully...
When did you realize that other people didn't?
So when I started to speak with investors, one of the most interesting part of speaking around the world is everyone asks you questions. Q&A is my favorite part. I wish I could speak for 5 minutes and then 55 minutes of Q&A. I'm not that cool yet. I think Robert Reich did that. I saw him speak once, and that was very cool. But I get asked these questions around the world, and different countries ask different questions, and there's a theme to each place. In the US and the UK in particular, there was this total disbelief that the government was anything other than authoritarian government. There is this sort of, what I started to think of as a, kind of like a Ivan Drago, Rocky IV view of the world, the sense that all communism is bad.
KGB.
Right. Everything, if it looks, smells, and seems like Putin, then it probably is. But there wasn't a sophisticated understanding of the degree to which a popular mandate in China mattered. Mm-hmm. And even though there's definitely a tighter grip on the population than there was pre-2017, the easiest way for the government to stay in power is to be popular. People forget that. And so there isn't a better incentivized body in the world to understand its people than Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. There isn't. Right. And they take that work seriously.
Right. But I mean, it's hard to imagine you coming from the States in China and talk to people and to reach this kind of understanding of what is really going on here, because most people come with the baggage, the preconceptions already, and it will be hard to change. Have you experienced that kind of change?
It's all I experience. And I wouldn't say that there's been a major change, but it's sort of why it's the value I see in these speaking things, because I was kind of cynical about speaking at first. I'm like, it's just sort of a lot of talking heads. And typically once you become a talking head, you also become distant with the expertise that first put you in that position. And so I was a little bit cynical about it, but I had a couple of things going for me. One of them is that I was American. I've been on panels with Chinese nationals who were discounted just because they were Chinese. I've had board members from Fortune 500 companies, after having a glass of wine, referring to an extraordinarily well accredited Chinese expert who I was on a panel with. And they're like, oh, that person, she's a fucking spy of the CCP. I don't know if I'm allowed to cuss, with no evidence, there's no bearing or background for that. So by being an American, by growing up in California, by having the background that I did, it gave a certain amount of third party credibility that is harder and almost impossible for Chinese nationals. The problem Chinese nationals face is that if they say anything that isn't negative China, they're seen as a pander of the CCP or in the pocket of the CCP. And by the way, I would say that the place where I faced the most resistance was not the US, it was the UK. 2018 was Trump time. And so Americans were more open to the idea that there were alternative ways of viewing the world that might have merit and alternative systems that could create some optimism about the system. So when I came in and young Chinese people are proud of where they're from and even proud of their government, Americans were like, I can understand the merit of some alternatives. Okay. Brits much less so. The question was always, when is the revolution going to happen? And even when I'm like, well, probably not very soon, they're like, okay, but really?
Okay.
So first, being an American helped. Second, I had a background in speech and debate. And so you talk about baggage, I think of it as a minefield.
Right.
I kind of know where those mines are placed around people's biases and preconceptions.
Right.
And so my job is to dance around it to ultimately be able to access something or present something that is understandable, accessible, and actionable. And so I would say I'm better than the average person at that, just because I had a background in it. I've had a lot of practice in it. The trick is, and you I'm sure face this all the time, is when you're in China watching global investors or global pundits talk about it, they're typically biased towards one direction, which is negative on China. And so our impulse is to press on the other side of the scale to try to balance it out. Now, when you do that, it's very difficult not to be seen as being pro-China. But you don't want to be advocating, you want to be informing. Right. And so finding the balance in the way that I communicated this between advocacy and information.
Right.
Because the same thing when I'm in China, my tendency is to push on the other side.
Yeah.
And so I'll end up being much more negative China than the average person here, just because I'm just trying to balance out views that are unbalanced. So when you're playing both sides, there's different information we'll present to either.
The great balancer, Zach.
It's, anyone who does what I think of as bridge work has to do this.
Right.
And we don't have a vocabulary for doing it for the most part, but we all do it. And we do it subconsciously, we give up on it and we don't even try. Most people don't even try because it feels like too much of an uphill battle.
So you talk about bridge work, and you also talk about the years during COVID you spent being locked out of China. You're in Mexico for most of the time. And you talk about this deep valley that you are in, groping around, not knowing what to do
Groping is not my favorite word for that, but it's yes.
Yeah. So most the people I knew that who went through this, they sort of left China. Did you consciously think about that the choice of going back, or is more of an accident?
It wasn't an accident at all. Mm-hmm. So I ended up getting married during COVID. My wife is Chinese. She was in the US for 8 years while I was in China for 8 years. Mm-hmm. And she didn't want to come back to China.
Oh.
It wasn't intuitive for her. Her job, it was a bad job market in China, and she was looking for work, and the US would have been, she would have gotten
the natural choice
paid much better. And she's going to listen to this and be like, yeah, it's true. So it was totally my initiative.
Okay.
And there's a couple of reasons. First, I've invested so much personally in this place. It's not just a job. It's my life. Mm-hmm. And it's the thing that I'm most interested in. It's the language that lights me up. It's a culture that I discover new things every day. Mm. And truthfully, I run kind of a bad business anyways. And so it wasn't like, I thought about taking a job elsewhere once or twice. And I thought about pivoting my work away from China once or twice. I even went in for a couple of interviews there. I got some job offers that were pretty attractive, but I wasn't ready to call it a day here. Mm. I did think that if we came back to China, I said this to you before, Robert, off the microphone, but 2013 was my worst year of business ever. Mm. And truthfully, through 2022 and 2023, there was a lot of short-term contracts, but we didn't have any long-term contracts. There wasn't any stability. Mm. And so even in 2022, which ended up being a good year, it was still just so much unknown. We had gotten so used to that. And so in 2023, when I came back, I was really looking to see, is this a place that still feels like a responsible place? No longer just so responsible is not a word that I would use when I was younger. There was nothing responsible about the decision. But once you get married, things change. Right. Like I said, I'm a recently young person. I've entered a new life stage now. Mm. And so I started to look for new opportunities. And we found some. I found some. And it's something that I'm really excited about. It's something that there was a big need for. And I still find myself being challenged and excited by China regularly. Is it a great moment to be running back to China? No. Is it the same go east young man sort of op-ed New York Times moment that was around in 2014, 2015? No, it is not. But for those of us who love it, it's not just when times are good that you love it. Yeah. You hope you can build a career around it. That's the thing. I see a lot of people who might love it, but are just tired and can't build a career and get older. Like you hit a life stage where it's like, okay, this whole just making it work thing is no longer really in the cards for me. Right. I've been lucky enough to be able to make it work and make it a sustainable, profitable business.
Yeah, that's also very remarkable because I knew that last year you actually had reached milestones after milestones in the business. You have a remarkable growth against the backdrop of almost the total loss of interest for China market. What we face at Big One Lab is, although our business is stable for the last 3 years, but you definitely see foreign interest withdrawing, right? And we're constantly battling that. So that really got me curious what you are doing right now, the main business focus. How do you manage to do that? What little opportunity that you found that, to the extent that you can share?
Yeah, of course. No, there's no secret to this. It's on my website. So no, but seriously, it's something that I'm proud of, and it's something that I'm proud to be doing in the community. So we call it YCG Bridgeworks. Bridgeworks being the new division. It's focused on cross-geography collaboration within global companies. So basically, you have global companies who have been relatively estranged for the last 4 or 5 years. Mm-hmm. They still have substantial commitments in China, but China-based teams and their global headquarters, or China-based teams and their regional offices elsewhere, right? For Chuhai companies, for companies that are going global, they're realizing that the quality of collaboration within their teams is having determinative impact on their business results. But the trick between collaboration is you can't measure it. You can't track it. And if you can't track it, companies can't prioritize it. You know, the old, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And so we actually, like 3 years ago, when my wife was in the hospital, longer story, we're not going to go into it now, but I ended up creating a diagnostic for one of my Fortune 500 clients who felt the strategy was already really good that we had developed with them, but the quality of collaboration between their teams was bad. So at first they brought this problem to me. How do we deepen trust between our teams? This is 2022, mid-COVID. And I'm like, I don't know. I'm not like a cross-cultural psychologist. Like this isn't, it's not, you know, it's when I was 2018, 2019, I was very taken with Ian Bremmer, not necessarily Brene Brown. You know, and Brene Brown is the big workforce trust, vulnerability leader. Brilliant, but not, you know, I was like, I really wanted to be on the frontier of discovery and strategy and what I saw as some of the harder parts of business. Hard versus hard soft, not hard in terms of difficulty.
Right.
But they kept asking for this. And
asking what specifically?
How do we deepen trust and improve collaboration between our US-based and China-based teams?
I see.
Because it is having determinative impact on the success of our business in China. And it's a mixture of market insights, right? So this is what we later figured out. But so I had a small background in psych studies. I had worked in the psych labs at Columbia University's business schools. So I wasn't totally a stranger to this. And so I put together a team of folks from Columbia who I had worked with, Harris, Deloitte, some really smart people. And we developed a diagnostic that would help. We called it the China Preparedness Index. As that
I like the name.
Went hand in hand with the Global Preparedness Index. By the way, we're now calling it the Global Collaboration Index. So it's evolved since then. But it was 5 pillars. And those different pillars allowed us to identify at all layers of the organization, or at least the team who we were researching, what is going on for that organization, what's working, what's not, and then hopefully how to fix it. It's a little bit like if you were to go into the doctor and you did a full checkup, you do a body scan, you do a brain scan, you do a full physical, and you're mostly really healthy, and you can know that from the test results. But you also see that your circulation isn't particularly good, or that you have weakness in your right leg, like you have a preference for your left leg over your right leg, and so it's developed systematic weakness over time. You're able to identify it, pinpoint it, and then improve it. The problem with collaboration is you can't do that. It usually gets relegated to DEI or this sort of wishy-washy thing that one of the leaders is interested in. Never gets prioritized. So we basically built a KPI for collaboration. We built a number of solutions to help improve that. And then we got to see over time, because again, we were monitoring it with this diagnostic, how what we were doing was creating positive impact for the team. I kind of was only doing this for one company at the time. And we did it in smaller beta sessions for smaller companies, but it needs to be they need to have substantive presence in both geographies for it to work. Like it's not for market entry. Everyone's like, oh, market entry, not for market entry. By the way, if you've been doing market entry these last 3 years, you're probably looking for work right now.
Yeah, it should be market exit.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it's been tough. When I got back to China, there's actually one very specific thing that happened. I had been asked to do some talks here in Shanghai. And by the way, I had like a decade plus long negative perception of Shanghai that I am working through right now. And so my coming here was like a major compromise to who I saw myself as for a long time. And so I credit actually the American Chamber of Commerce with helping me to get past that, because a lot of the people I met at AmCham were really substantive, really smart. And I gave one talk at AmCham's HR Summit. I gave their keynote back in 2011. And I don't want to say it was a throwaway, but it wasn't clearly related to the business I was doing at the time. It was basically a wake-up call for China-based teams that at a moment where there was the fewest amount of foreign executive visits, foreign journalists on the ground, tourist visits to China, at a moment where China was more consequential to the global economy but more opaque to global executives than it had been in decades, and at a moment where every single global organization was reevaluating their China strategy, really at that time, China-based teams both didn't know that was happening and weren't involved in those deliberations.
They'll cut out.
Which is a crisis. Like if you're, it's an existential crisis for those China-based teams.
Right.
And so I gave a talk, I think we called it like How to Win Friends, Influence, and People at Headquarters, which is a riff on How to Win Friends and Influence People, the famous book. And it went through this 5-step process that we had seen with some of our clients who were, it wasn't just that one client. We had done this with a couple of other smaller clients, and we just seen what worked. And it resonated with a huge number of people at that conference. And we got reached out to by 6 or so Fortune 500 China-based teams. Keep in mind, we'd only been hired by US-based teams before.
Right.
And so this last year, it's been learning to work with, research, even sell to, just to be totally transparent, China-based teams of global companies or China-based teams of Chinese companies who are going global.
So you think this is not some kind of old need that was rediscovered by you? It's just like mostly entirely new kind of demand, right?
So there's the world of cross-cultural collaboration, not new.
Yeah.
This stuff has been around for a while. Cross-geography collaboration is a little bit different. It combines culture with things like process, language, market dynamics. One of the pillars that we measure is market knowledge, as well as headquarters versus regional office dynamics. So we have a different diagnostic for headquarters than we do for regional offices. And the regional office diagnostic is the same for China as it would be for India, as it would be for Mexico. So there's power dynamics in the mix that have nothing to do with culture. Culture might amplify those power dynamics, and they certainly do here in China with East Asian cultures and deference towards hierarchy in particular. But they're not defined by culture. So is this new or not? The truth is, for China-based teams, this is definitely a signal of a crisis. The fact that they need us, it's a little bit of a crisis product. And I'm conscious of that. For decades, maybe at least a decade, China-based teams have been able to point at the numbers and haven't had to collaborate well. Because they've just been able to say, look at our numbers. What do you mean we're not doing well? We don't have to be nice. We don't have to be smart. We don't have to advocate for ourselves. We don't have to understand the wants and needs of headquarters. We just deliver. And for headquarters, they often felt like they didn't understand China. But have you seen the numbers recently? They figured the numbers spoke for themselves. Yeah. And, if you're a manager in China and you've been at a Fortune 500 company for 15 years, 20 years, you never managed through a downturn. The financial crisis didn't hit China. There was a bulwark of economic stimulus that protected China from it. It was a sort of rare bright spot in that period of time. And so you have managers who have never had to be vulnerable. They've never had to communicate. They've never had to advocate for themselves in absence of great numbers. And you have headquarters who is trying to understand what they still know is the second largest economy in the world. Most of us forget that, by the way, right? It's still the second largest economy in the world. It's also larger than the third, fourth, fifth, and sixth combined. So we increasingly live in an economy of two. For any global executive who knows math, they see that and they're like, all right, we still need to be in China if their risk profile is adequate and allows that. How do we do it? And how do we do it with our team rather than sort of at odds with our team? Because the truth is, China collaboration, can I cuss? Are we allowed to cuss on this?
Yeah, sure.
It's fucking hard, man. This is what most people don't appreciate, is that a lot of the semiconductor companies we've spoken with, who are now being forced out of the market because of risk and compliance, they're doing it with an exhale and a thank God. Because even though there's phenomenal talent here, collaborating with China-based teams across time zones and culture has been a slog for them. It's been difficult. You cannot do it between the hours of 9 to 5. It explicitly cannot happen between those hours. And China's difficult. If you look at a tool like Erin Myers and you look at her culture map, across every single spectrum, the US and China are almost at opposite sides of the spectrum. Communication, timeliness, attitudes towards hierarchy. A lot of the labor of working between the US and China has nothing to do with business. It has to do with navigating culture and process-driven and logic-driven differences. And most people aren't trained for or prepped for that labor. Or it's not even acknowledged in their remit, right? And so if you're in the US and you're like, all right, I could either work on China, which even though is a growth market for us, it's freaking hard and tiring and I don't get the language and it's far away when I have to travel there I'm kind of afraid to travel there because I hear people are getting locked up or there's COVID or whatever it is. Or I can work on Mexico, same time zone. I like tacos. It's an easy flight. Or I can work on Italy. Not really growth, but do I want to be in Milan a couple times a year? Absolutely. Or even Australia. Even though it's far away, it's so culturally proximate that they're easy to work with. The difficulty in the day-to-day, the personal labor, means that it's been hard to attract A players to China-based work. And for Chinese companies going global, one of their biggest challenges is management. The product is always good. With Chinese companies, you can bet that if it survived the competition of China, the product is great. But global management is hard. And these companies are making those early mistakes now, and they're doing it painfully.
What's the most common mistakes or problems that you find in this kind of collaboration between global headquarters and China teams?
The easiest problems to diagnose are incentives problems. For instance, China-based teams are very well incentivized to hit quarterly and annual numbers. And so that's what they prioritize. That's what they're proud of. They're execution oriented. The problem is they need to have more strategic ownership now because the Chinese market is much more complex. It's much more competitive, and they need to be able to keep up. If they're waiting for some guy named Jack based in New York to understand the China market well enough to empower them to make local decisions in time, it's never going to happen. Jack will never know the China market well enough to keep up with it. And so even though Chinese executives need to be strategic, they're incentivized to be operational. That's an easy one. On the flip side of that with headquarters, market knowledge. So we track market knowledge as one of the pillars. And the reason we track it is because executives need to be taken along for the ride enough. They need to understand China enough to get out of their team's way here, to empower them to make strategic decisions, and to feel confident that the China-based team is doing what they should. Because there's a cultural issue of China-based teams can be deferential. China-based teams can become yes men or yes women to headquarters. Or they could, the old when yes means no issue. This comes up all the time in cultural training. Happens with Japan, Korea, China. What do you do when yes means no? Well, the truth is, if you have an executive in China who says yes and does something different, that's often a blessing. Because they're often reacting to market dynamics on the ground that are different than that guy named Jack understands. And rather than taking the labor to explain to Jack why they are what they are, they either don't have time for it or it's just too hard. They're just acting on the right information on their own. And so market knowledge is one of those things that we always try to boost, and we always try to help China-based teams help their US-based teams or globally based teams understand in order to help those teams empower China-based teams to make the right decisions better. So you boost market knowledge, you actually improve the quality of life for the China-based teams, and you give them more strategic ownership. The quality of life thing is also underappreciated. I said before that collaboration can't happen between 9 to 5. Absolutely true. And so most people are working, in China especially, most people are working 2 jobs. They have their 9 to 6, where they face the demands of the market. They work hard to keep up with increasingly competent Chinese competitors. They try to execute on the strategy that they've laid out with their headquarters. But then they also have their 6 to midnight, where they explain to people back home for me, so back in the US, their headquarters, why they're doing what they're doing and why China works differently than other markets. You do that for 6 months, tiring. You do that for 2 years, it's exhausting. And so how do you build mechanisms to not advocate for yourself? Again, this goes back to the tension that I was talking about before between advocacy and informing. But how do you consistently inform global headquarters of what's going on here in a contextual way so that they're not making decisions only based on Bloomberg or New York Times or Wall Street Journal headlines or some of the leading market data that they're looking at? One of the hardest things for global teams is to put what's going on, the headlines they're seeing on China into context. How big is it? How small is it? And there's no greater resource for that than their China-based teams. But their China-based teams very rarely prioritize the work of keeping their headquarters up to date in a comprehensive way because it feels like a waste of time for them. But what I always have to tell them, and we do this often with, including some Fortune 10 clients, it's going to pay off. Like if you invest in bringing your headquarters along for the ride, in keeping them smart about the market, in becoming a source of truth for them as an alternate to their primary sources of media, which have a crisis-driven view of China. If you can become that source of truth for them, it's going to lead to more people, more influence, more impact, and at least an even-handed approach to the market, rather than an approach that is someone is pressing on the scales of negativity when they're looking at the market. There's one more that I can bring up, which is, I said this before, China-based teams are not used to having to advocate for themselves. And so one of the things we see consistently is a communications issue that is heavily informed by culture. And so this is where culture comes in. If you look at how hierarchy works in a Confucian culture versus a non-Confucian culture, and you just look at education systems between the U.S. and China. And anyone who's been at a liberal arts college in the U.S. knows that the role of professors, especially in smaller classes, is really to teach you to speak out.
Yeah, facilitator.
Facilitator. Yeah. And if you look at the 5 Confucian relationships, they're all dictated by hierarchy. Government and citizen, easiest, but certainly teacher and student. And I went to HKU for 6 months and I got spoken to for 6 months. I found time to go talk with the professors afterwards, but there was no call and response. Yeah. Versus at Columbia, every single professor was trying to egg you on and push you and expand the way you think. Now you translate that to the workplace. Even though you have extraordinary talent here in China, in group settings, you have team members who very rarely will speak out. And so there's this issue of the silent brainstorm. Headquarters sets a call for 8 a.m. their time, 11 p.m. in China, already pretty tough. And they're here to solve the China problem, whatever that problem is. And everyone gets on the phone, and again, Jack, I'm sorry for Jack, gets on the call, is like, all right, here's the problem. What do you guys think? And then they get crickets on the China side. On the China side, here's what you have going on. You have different levels of people in the organization. And so you have an executive in the organization who's not speaking, and you have the person who works for him who's also not speaking, or her who's not speaking. You typically don't have people speaking out at different levels of the organization. The more junior person in the organization doesn't want to risk saying something. It's a sort of, the idea. Like if the more you speak, the more likely you are to make a mistake. The nail that stands up gets hammered down, however you want to describe it. You also have more senior people within the organization not speaking out because they don't want to make a mistake in front of their more junior people or jeopardize their reputation in front of the global team. You also there's not practice in that communal brainstorming concept. And so one of the really basic things that we have to teach China-based teams is that it's okay to directly communicate. You have to break patterns of interaction in order to do that. So you actually have to practice it. So we'll put in trainings for direct communication, which help. We often start with question asking, by the way. That's the easiest start to direct communication. It's hard to just be this sort of confident executive. Here's what I think. But it's easy. It's much easier for people to start asking incisive questions. And through questions, you can start to influence strategy. You also have to create a culture and tell executives who want the outcomes, but they've risen up in this particular culture, which is that it's okay for people at different levels of an organization to have disagreements in an open setting, which is anathema for most people who have grown up in China. It's not okay. It's never been okay. They've been penalized for it. They've never been rewarded for it. And so creating that culture takes time.
Yeah. Sounds like a mammoth project, right? It's very fundamental and it's very cultural. So what's your deliverable? You still need to provide a product, right? Yeah. So what is the deliverable right now?
So we have 3 different tracks. We typically start with what we call the Bridgeworks baseline. It's an 8-week program where we do basically a cultural intelligence and a needs discovery process. We do it through what we call rapid research. Actually, during the workshop, we'll do a research assessment in that short period of time. So it's kind of the easiest onboarding here in China. We found that in China, Specifically, consulting is very wishy-washy. People want trainings, they want diagnostics. And so we combine them as an easy yes, just so that some of these new businesses can get to know who we are. At the end of these 8 weeks, by the way, you can stop and we give you what we call the collaboration health plan. You can either run it yourself, which is fine. People usually can't. And so they end up working with us after that. But we give you the roadmap to do it. We really, I don't want to handcuff anybody to us. And in a perfect world, we're also running this simultaneously wherever their headquarters is, which we've done in the past. Good bridges work two ways. After that, we will do the quantitative deep dive. The reason we do the quantitative deep dive after that is it takes more buy-in. You need 100+ people to take it. It's a bigger risk for organizations to bring in a consultant to do this. So the 8-week Bridgeworks baseline is a little bit like a tryout for us, so they know that we can do what we say. So we have diagnostics. We do training. So we create training programs for organizations, a mixture of custom and off the shelf, to help to instill what we think of as bridge competencies. Direct communication, which I just brought up, is a really simple one. So learning how to directly communicate in brainstorming scenarios for China-based, but we've also had success with this in Greater China region as well as Japan and Korea, places with really like a Confucian education system backing. How to create comfort with that in global settings. So that's one training track. We have a cultural intelligence training track that we can put both the China-based and US-based teams through. Again, those are increasingly regionally agnostic, although of course for the cultural element, they are region specific. And then we actually have workforce solutions. So this is where it gets a little bit harder to define and it turns into kind of consulting speak. But there are things that organizations can do that are neither training nor diagnostics that have to do with the structure of how they interact with one another. I mean, really pure management consulting stuff that improves cross-geography collaboration that we've seen be successful and we can instill within organizations. And so that usually takes the form of advisory plus solutions, where we're working with an executive who believes that this should be part of their organization, and we're implementing between 3 and 9 different solutions that we have seen be successful. We base those solutions based on the outcome of the GCI, the Global Collaboration Index. So again, we don't want to give someone something they don't need. It's like you don't want your doctor providing prescriptions for drugs that aren't going to help you because you're not sick in that direction. Right. By the way, it's not just for sick companies. Typically, our best clients are actually the most successful companies. They're the companies who it's already working for them, and they've realized that it's worth investing in. And so often, we'll work with one team within a larger company, and that team will already be the highest performer in this. And so they'll bring us in to supercharge it. That will then end up being an example to other teams, and then we end up working with an entire organization because of it.
Good. When you mentioned this bridging between U.S. headquarters and China team, I cannot help but think of the broader U.S.-China relations. I mean, this may be a really far-fetched question, but does your experience with building this kind of bridge, do you think there's some lessons over there for...
Oh God.
I mean, if today you are meeting someone in the diplomatic circle, for example, if you do provide training for them, what kind of training that you think that each side will need to?
So it's not far-fetched at all. In 2019, I mean, all the way up through 2023, and I was doing speaking. I was a subject matter expert that would be brought into companies and these consultancies who work adjacent to governments to talk about things. And I was increasingly in the room with generals, right? So in pre-COVID, it was people-focused. Post-COVID, it was government-focused. Simple as that. And I started to hate it. Some of the job offers I started to get were from these macro think tank or macro just pure consultancies. But it was mostly talking about geopolitics. So basically taking the median citizen theorem to its logical conclusion and taking this people first approach, but really giving geopolitical advice. And I don't want to say I hated it because it was mentally stimulating, but it was deeply depressing. And so part of Bridgeworks has been a decision, even though it's not the best way to make money. Like if I was like a purely economic animal, this is not what I would be doing, to be clear. It's definitely mission driven, even though it's also, it's a for-profit business. I'm not going to pretend like it's not. I like the idea of helping people get along better. And I've now seen it impact thousands of people. I'm hoping tens of thousands of people by the end of the next year or two. Governments, I think about the incentives of places. Most people in government who I speak with have nothing to gain from being anything but tough on China. And I've spoken with, at certain summits, I've gotten to speak with senators about this. And there's no political capital to be gained from being anything but tough on China. Mm-hmm. And so even when they in private have been like, I went to China, I had a great time. These people are really industrious. You'll never hear ex-senators say that to the public because there's nothing to gain and a pretty substantial amount to lose. I'm very curious how this evolves these next 4 years during a Trump presidency.
That's my question too. How did you get your business prepared for another 4 years of Trump?
I am in the smaller camp of believing that a Trump presidency doesn't have to be worse.
Okay.
I'm not gonna go so far as to say it's better just because there's too many unknowns. Mm-hmm. But the truth is Biden was much tougher on China than Trump was. Oh, he evolved. Mm-hmm. Biden continued and evolved the Trump trajectory that was set out 16 to 2020. Mm-hmm. But he did it much more intelligently. Like the CHIPS Act was surgical. If you're trying to kneecap the high-tech strategic emerging industries of a nation, semis is the way to do it. And I've been lucky enough to work adjacent to or with a number of semiconductor companies over the years. And I've just seen them cope with it. Here in China and elsewhere, it was a tactical strike. And so even though Trump has been loud on China, he hasn't always hit China where it hurts to the same degree that the Biden administration did. Mm-hmm. Now, Harris, we don't really know what she was going to be on China. Waltz has some China background. But what you do know is that they're going to be coalition focused. They're going to hire wicked smart people. And it's likely that they're going to be pretty tough on China because that's where political sentiment is right now. And so if you get America leaning into its ultimate strength, which is a coalition, right? The allies, not acting unilaterally, but acting multilaterally, which is what she would have done. If you get her hiring great and smart people who are incentivized to be tough on China, it's a pretty predictable outcome. Like, yes, you would maybe try to avoid war because she's a measured person, but it would be continued tough legislation. That's my belief, at least. Mm-hmm. You look to the other side with Trump. Typically hires less intelligent people. It's not to bash everyone who works under the Trump administration, but it's less surgical, less tactical in understanding the ins and outs of what will hurt China most. He's also, to a certain degree, a populist leader. And so if you go back to the median citizen theorem, that comes from the median voter theorem, which is that leaders are very well incentivized to do what their median voter wants most. Yeah. And especially for populist leaders, that typically holds true. If you look at what Trump's median voter wants most, it is not tough tariffs, which would drastically increase their cost of living. Yeah. It's actually the opposite of that, which is to lower inflation, to make cost of living more accessible to more people. Right. And so when I look at the likely outcomes of a Trump first year or two, even though there's a lot of noise on tariffs, it's hard for me to imagine where that benefits him. Because there isn't much political capital to be gained from trade right now. There is significant political capital to be gained from lowering inflation. And it's hard to do that with 60% tariffs on China. Yeah. What I do think is, and I'm bringing up Marco Papic again here because I talked with Marco about this recently, and I have a lot of admiration for his approach to understanding geopolitics. If you look at the constraints of Trump and where he's incentivized, I think it's likely that he will be using these tariffs as a bargaining chip, which is great because he hasn't paid $1 for them yet, truthfully. Like he hasn't had to act on them at all, but we're all taking it as fact. So if he takes those off the table, it'll look like a major concession that he's never actually had to do anything for, aside from talk. Chinese companies who are desperately want to access the U.S. market, for those that are not in direct competition with the most prominent U.S. industries, particularly ones with the largest lobbying base, Like for instance, I think EVs are always going to have a lot of trouble accessing the US. But for most Chinese companies, I think they're going to be asked to do what Saudi is doing, which is to bring major regional bases to the US, to put a meaningful amount of their production to the US, to make, if you want to access the US market, similar to what China has done, by the way. Over the years, you have to be committed to this region aside from just selling the end product to the end consumer.
Right.
And so it'll be a great win for Trump as he would like to paint it. It would also allow for the cost of living to not be drastically affected. Of course, manufacturing in the US means that it still will.
That's also could be the best case scenario for you because you are, in that case, help Chinese companies help manage US subsidiaries.
They're going to do that anyways. So I'm not like, the amount of Chinese China is extraordinarily entrepreneurial and the survival instinct is stronger than any place I've seen on earth. It's a bit of a cultural revolution hangover. Chinese people are tough and they can survive in difficult situations. It's not just cultural revolution, by the way. The pace of change these last 30 years has meant that you adapt or you get washed away.
Right.
And so if you've been successful in China, this, by the way, is what I hear when I talk with a lot of local investors. If you can survive in China, not thrive, just survive, you can outcompete people anywhere else on earth. So like the word in China right now is juan, right? 内卷. We have so much internal competition that it means that if you can make it out of here, you're just tougher. And so the amount of people I know who are trying to find ways into the US market, even when it's not allowed. So if the doors open and it becomes easier, it will certainly be good for my business. Although that's not what I'm hoping for. I'm hoping for it just because I like people more than I like governments. It's sort of a simplistic view of the world, but it's what allows me to keep doing what I'm doing. There's one last piece on Trump, which is that he's unilateral, right? Yeah. The first thing that he did, tear up the TPP in his last term. It created the opportunity for China to rise into a power vacuum. China before late 2015 was a regional power at best. They've become a global power during the Trump years. And even though Trump creates a lot of chaos and lack of predictability, he has a preference for unilateral activity or even multilateral activity that undermines our alliances, particularly with his interest in Russia. And any undermining of sort of the old guard of post-World War II US-based hegemony is positive for China.
Any final message or words for the audience?
Get your ground feel right. So part of my crisis, the 3 years I was locked out of China, was I felt myself becoming dumber. I felt myself just interpreting other people's op-eds. I felt myself parroting, without even really realizing it, just the ecosystem of my primary way to access China was through news. It made me more hysterical about the market. I was riding the ups and downs of whatever buzzwords or concepts hit the news and then were echoed. Because there's so many fewer journalists on the ground right now. The echo chamber effect is way worse. So people in DC and New York are just writing the same scoop, but with their own spin on it, even though it's not informed by ground feel. And so get your ground feel right. That could be talking to people like Robert. That could be reading his wonderful Substack. Everybody go subscribe, paying customer. It's going to be great. But it also means talking with your team. Your team in China is very likely your most underutilized resource. And so this we see all the time. And for teams in China, speak up, because there's a shift happening in global organizations and it's going to happen with or without you. It would be better if it happened with you and you could impact towards which direction it shifted, because it's a shame for all of your market knowledge to only be applied to the market rather than educating, informing, and helping to evolve the perspectives of your global headquarters.
Great. Thank you so much for coming and speaking to our subscribers.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks, everybody. I'm a big fan of Robert's, as you guys know, and so continue to subscribe and make sure he can keep doing this for a long, long time.
Make sure to go to Young China Group.
There we go. Just Mutual Affection Club.
Thank you. Bye-bye.